Thank you, Rob, very much. Welcome. I've been coming to the Synergy conferences for a number of years now, and I was commenting to Gary as I came through the door. What I love coming up, there is a palpable vibe in the room, right? People are so excited to be here. The content is great, and what I think about Synergy Alberta and the groups that form it, really, we do a lot of work in the Canadian Society of Unconventional Resources across this country and in jurisdictions where there is no culture of energy development, no culture of energy conversation. We're doing a lot of work in Quebec and on the East Coast, for example, now. And one of the things I think we take for granted in Alberta is what a century of energy development has done for us in terms of the ability for groups like the Synergy groups themselves on the local landscape, but more broadly come together in conferences like this and have this kind of dialogue. We should remember that it was only 5 months ago that we celebrated the centennial of the first serious drilling activity with the drilling of Dingman number 1 and Dingman number 2 in Turner Valley, south of Calgary. And that really set off Alberta's and Western Canada's first petroleum boom. And as a result of that, and it's nice to see that the Alberta Energy Regulator is here today because, of course, last year we celebrated 75 years of great regulation in this province. And that regulatory dynamic came about because in Turner Valley we started to understand, oh, we're doing things to the reservoir that aren't in the long-term interests of either the actual molecules themselves, but also in terms of how we conserve them and how we think about them in the public interest. So it's an important dynamic to realize that in Alberta, when we think about things like national energy conversations, we do have the burden of leadership that comes with a century of development. And even in BC, where the northern part of the province has a real strong sense of what it takes to develop resources, not so true in the rest of the province. And so that's kind of fascinating. And so Synergy bears a big responsibility to be a leadership voice in the rest of Canada. But just because we've been at it for a century doesn't mean that we get it right all the time. And so the focus of my conversation today, and it's a suitable introduction to our great conversation on hydraulic fracturing coming up next, is the dynamic of the social license. And really, you'll see in my title there is I'm deliberately putting the unconventional resources sector into the spotlight because that's the current thing that sort of preoccupies us when we think about shale gas and shale oil development. So in the half hour that I have available to me, I'm going to talk about my views on what the challenges are with social licensing in the current context. I'm going to make an argument for a different process, a different way of thinking about the approach to social licensing in which groups like the Synergy groups and Synergy Alberta play a critical and important role because you guys are already doing this stuff. I'm going to talk about the role that energy literacy plays in these licensing conversations, and again, hats off to Synergy Alberta and all the great work it does because you guys are way ahead of this curve already. But I'm going to talk about the unconventional sector. I go to a lot of meetings, right? I sometimes have to go to meetings to have meetings to figure out why I go to so many meetings. But I sit in a lot of energy boardrooms and I sit in a lot of groups, in industry associations that I'm involved with. I'm starting to hear these words, but if we're only more truthful, if we're only more transparent, people will trust us more. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we're ready for the triple T talk yet. We've got a lot of work to do before we get there. And again, Synergy Alberta and its members will play a big role in that. So this was from some of the panelists. We're going to, just getting some major context around some of the other things that are happening in this great conference. Synergy Alberta, if you haven't been to one of these conferences before, puts on the best, most eclectic, truly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary conferences ever. And so let's talk about social licensing. So we work in an industry where we tend to beat the meaning out of words, right? And those of you who are in business, what does paradigm shift really mean anymore, right? We beat it useless. We beat it senseless, left it on the side of the road of meeting. It's the same with Synergy itself, right? For those of you who grew up in the 80s and the 90s and listened to management consultants come in and tell your bosses how your organizations could be more synergistic, we've learned to distrust this word. Synergy is putting the trust back into it. Sustainability, making the argument that it's a very slippery thing and that we're losing our ability to define it in ways that make meaning for folks. Again, if we don't come to terms, and I know Jim Martin's part of the equation here today in terms of presentation, working very hard with a lot of invested stakeholders, but we have to define what energy literacy means very soon, or it won't mean anything at all. It's the same with the social license. And sometimes in this industry, we pick on words and we use them because they make sense to ourselves, but they don't make sense to the folks we're going to talk about. And that's why I like to raise the issue of unconventionals. What does that really mean? I mean, how would you feel if you were going to have your brain surgery done by the Canadian College of Unconventional Neurosurgeons? Right? You think about the words that make sense to people inside the industry, not necessarily don't make sense to folks outside. So there's a great publication out there. Many of you probably use it, Our Petroleum Challenge. It's produced by the Canadian Centre for Energy Information now in its 8th edition. It's a wonderful tool. But I won't read it to you, but this is how it defines social license in a tiny little box buried somewhere 2/3 of the way through the book in terms of the conversation on sustainability. The point I would make out to you, it's very local and very site-specific in terms of what it defines social license to mean. Very local and very site-specific. Keep those things in mind. So I would ask you to think about what's really so social about the license, the social license. My argument is that we make a lot of things up about it and we put the burden on those two words and we're not prepared to support the burden. For a lot of the companies that operate the oil and gas industry, both in the operations sphere and the service and supply sphere, they think about the social license merely in a regulatory context about dropping off here, guys, at least they have to do in terms of communicating with their stakeholders and making outreach to them. And often we have great regulators in the country, great regulators in Alberta and BC and on the national scale, but unfortunately, they can't move fast enough to keep up with social expectations and the way people think about how they consume energy and their expectations of the folks who produce it for their consumption. And so as a result, we usually get compromise and standing in and we fool ourselves and we think we've achieved consensus. And those of you in Synergy know fundamentally there's a huge difference in the spectrum of meaning on compromise and consensus. So the argument is social license full of meaning or is it bereft of meaning? So, but think about licensing. Think about the notion of licensing that invades the rest of our lives beyond this. Licensing is based on a set of accepted knowledge standards, right? Set of conventions, social conventions that are enshrined in law, and they're both legal and normative. They're the things that we think about. And when we think about one of the ones that invades our life most, we think about how we drive and the way we're licensed to drive. And the way we're licensed to drive through the whole life cycle when we first get behind the wheel. I like going to foreign jurisdictions and talking about how Alberta, you can get a driver's license at learner's permit at age 14 as a result of our agricultural sector legacy. But the critical thing about licensing in most jurisdictions when it regards to driving, real estate, law practices, engineering practices, there's a commitment from both parties to the licensing process. And that's one of the flaws in our social licensing process right now. There's a commitment only on one side. So when we think about the challenges with that, what does it mean? And so we often see this, and you deal with these companies where there's this bit of a victims or a martyrs complex, usually that the companies feel because they have these heavy burdens of meeting the social license. There's often a huge, and I say ignorance in a non-pejorative context here, by stakeholders. They get to come to the table and participate in a licensing process with no onus of knowledge on their part. You probably see that very much with some of the debates that occur locally through the various synergy groups. And what that results in most cases, is a failure by both sides to invest adequately in preparing for the licensing process. When I say regulators get it wrong, it's typically a function of timing. So presumably you'll hear today a little bit about some exciting changes in the regulatory front on risk-based and resource play-based regulation. Those are exciting things, but just by their very nature, they move out of sync with social expectations. So we have this imbalance of knowledges that leads to what I call the AAA whammy. And that's also inflamed by a media that often, to be fair to media, they're working against huge business model constraints. The newsrooms of 10 years ago are not the newsrooms of today in terms of the time and effort they can put into putting context around public debates. And so we end up with this AAA kind of conflict of adversity, acrimony, and animus. And that, to my mind, is hardly social in terms of the way. So if we think about our big debates and how they're playing out, and this is where I want to raise the point about the challenge with the way the industry says, well, social license is just about getting landowners and community stakeholders permission to have a project. No, folks, it's way bigger than that. Gateway is a great example of something that is both specifically local and yet hugely national at the same time. If you think about fracturing debate, we're going to hear from 4 great experts in the next panel on fracturing. We were unprepared as a society to have a debate on a technology that's 60 years old, right? We were unprepared. That narrative got away from us. And of course, the oil sands, which is an area that I'm very familiar with, we've never been out from behind the 8 ball on who controls the narrative and the conversation on how to talk about responsible resource development. So at the end of the day, you end up dealing with dueling facts and dueling figures, and the set of perspectives is my facts is stronger than your facts is a challenge. And so if we don't have balance in those conversations, we can't really have discussion that advances proposition. And so I come back to this point of chastising the industry for trying to talk about truth, transparency, and trust before the industry is very ready to have that conversation. So here's where we end up. And for those of you who know your Bible a little bit, in 3 of the 4 Gospels, when Jesus returns to Nazareth and he says to his disciples, hey, how come nobody's paying attention to him? Hey, you know, if you don't understand that part of it, just have teenagers at home, right? You're prophets without honor in your own home and in your own land. And we see ourselves as that in industry. Well, we're doing all this wonderful thing on behalf of the demand side of the energy economy. What don't they get about that? They see us as prophets without honor in an entirely different context. But what if there was a process, right? What if there was a way that we think about teaching and reteaching and testing and retesting that defined new baselines of knowledges for energy producers and their partners, as well as folks who consume the energy, the demand side of it, that really, as a set of core principles, approached the challenges of specific site projects, mega projects in the oil sands, pipeline development, national debates around the implications of technology. Set of principles that underpinned the approach to that. And as I said, sat in front of all the ways and means that we develop energy in this country. So here's where I put out to you the idea of a learner's permit. That's something that sits in front of the social license, communicative license to collaborate. And so really the principles of a graduated system prevail. For those of you, most of the folks in this room didn't have to go through the GDL process in this province of getting a learner's permit. You hopped behind the car or the truck and off you went. But now, you know, as a father of a number of young folks my son just turned 25, and it was only pressed against that 1 month thing that he had left. He only became a full driver, driving since he was 14, but became a fully licensed driver 9 years later, right? And the rigor of his final test was pretty strong. But he understood the notion of entering into what he had to understand from a graduated process, that licensing process was going to work with him over time. So for a lot of the folks who are here in terms of the Gay Robinsons and all the great facilitators of the world, huge role to play in facilitating these learner's permit conversations. And if we had this different approach, if we had a defined graduated licensing process in front of the social license to operate, what I think we'd get is better consensus orientation to our major discussions and debates. And we'd have balanced and rational discussion and respectful discourse. And here's an important point, and I hear this all the time, is, well, we need to debate these things more effectively. We need to debate these things and debate, debate, debate. You look at the real meaning of the word debate, and for those of you who participated in debating clubs in high school and so on and so forth, debate is about a win-loss proposition. There's always a winner and a loser in debate. Think about all the leadership discussions and debates you hear on political races on TV. Jim Prentice won that debate. Justin Trudeau won that debate. The notion of debate inherently speaks to a win-loss proposition. And without getting too fancy and going back too far in history, what we need is the notion of dialectic, right? This is the kind of conversation that happens in synergy groups, is dialectic conversation, which seeks to achieve balanced, truthful outcomes to major thorny issues. So if you only remember 2 words from this whole presentation, take away the idea that we need more dialectic, which is about coming to a consensus, right? Debate usually produces only compromise. So when you think about the role that energy literacy, we've come a long way in the energy literacy foot race. I'd argue it's a race that has no finish line, and we're always moving ahead. But we have to nail down some baselines on what that means to folks. Energy literacy is very contextual and it's very contingent. I work on 2 major industry technology boards where I'll sit with individuals, engineers and geoscientists who in one moment are incredibly literate. They've spent 35 years mapping out the reservoirs. And in the next moment, they're into a major policy debate on where the price of carbon will settle in the Canadian economy, and they're fundamentally not literate in that debate. And so we have to understand that literacy is very unique to the individuals. It's very unique to the circumstances and the context you're in, but we need to start nailing down some baselines. And so is literacy, energy literacy, about economics? Is it about technology? Do you need to know everything there is about how many frac stages there are in a particular horizontal leg and what the efficacy of the microseismic readings were to be energy literate? Is it about policy? Do you need to be literate in some fashion to follow the idea of a national energy strategy? Is it environmental literacy? So you can see it's a big bundle of very complicated things, but we need to start nailing down the component parts of it, and Jim is going to talk about some great progress that's been made on that front. But I'd say in the learner's permit context, there are 3 basic R's that align with that reading, writing, arithmetic kind of context that underpins literacy conversations more generally. And I think if we get the idea of energy, economics, and the environment correct as the fundamental starting points, these will help us resolve 2 key things that float around our industry. And again, here's about meaning of words. There is a lot of misinformation out there and disinformation. And we use those words interchangeably, and they mean fundamentally different things. So for those of you who know World War II history, Joseph Goebbels was a master of disinformation. There's a deliberateness to disinformation that goes out there. And so a lot of the groups that oppose energy development use disinformation technology and tools very wisely. But we're also befuddled with a lot of misinformation. That's information that gets taken and ruptured from context and fact innocently without any malevolent intent. And so it's important to know when you're dealing with these things in an energy literacy context, what is the context on that? And so those things are important when we're talking about local projects and policy debates and generally technology discussions. So again, so when you think about licensing, the first steps is we need to create, and this is my geological friends always tease me for my poor metaphors, but we need to create a much higher level of social porosity. We've got a lot of pores of knowledge in this industry on the ground within synergy groups and energy companies, but we don't necessarily have the permeability that drives knowledge across those pores. And that's the second point. And that's why the work that Synergy Alberta does so important. If you think in terms of how you get oil and gas out of reservoirs, you understand the pore structure, you understand the permeability, and then you figure out how you're going to take advantage of those 2 things to drive the fluids from the reservoir. And you're putting energy into the reservoir to do that, and that's what Synergy Alberta does. But Synergy Alberta, to extend this metaphor to its logical conclusion, is geologists and drilling engineers will tell you, got to know where the cap rock is, right? That's the impermeable rock that traps things. And we've got a lot of cap rock in our organizations. We've got a lot of cap rock in our communities, metaphorically, that we need to break down and move the hydrocarbons of knowledge past. So when you think about opportunities that Synergy Alberta has in front of it to configure not only what you're doing locally, but to make a large impact on the national energy debate, these are the things this group can start to do, is in your various groups, start to define what are the elements of a licensing process. Talk about, just journalize the 10 things you're constantly explaining to your friends and your family about. I moderated a panel discussion at the World Petroleum Youth Congress last fall, 275 young professionals, 35 and under in the room. And I asked the question, how many of you get picked on by your friends and family for your career choice? All 275 hands went up. I said, how many of you keep your hands up. How many of you believe that the companies you work for and the industry in which your companies work deserve the reputation for which you're pilloried? Every hand stayed up, right? So we have a challenge in terms of figuring out how to talk about this industry in a way that occurs at the curling rinks and at soccer pitches and the supermarkets. So define Synergy Alberta's role and your role as members of individual groups in terms of the things that you also don't know about energy, but you've always wanted to know, but been too afraid to ask. And you'll find that that's a really eye-opening experience. And then for companies and the communities in which they work, get together and talk about the top 10 things on your lists around, here's what we need to do to be examples on the licensing process in communities of practice broader than ours. So just as I close here to wrap, so here's how the Alberta government describes the GDL, or the Graduated Learner's Permit, and I'll let you read it for a second. And I've just swapped out some words. So this is the learner's communicative license to participate. key principles here. It puts demand on both the corporations and their partners. It puts demands on governments and regulators, but it puts demands of knowledge on the consumers of energy information. So, and this is just a couple of points on why shale is so prospective. The world always needs a poster child. Canada is a poster child. The shale revolution is not going to go away. Fundamentally, it's the current sort of target of discussion and debate. And you know, the oil sands has got a bit of a buy for the moment. But the whole point on this is understand how industry activity explodes much faster than the ability of groups to keep in front of the narratives and to keep participatory in the narratives. And so just as we close here, and I have one last point I'd like to make. So coming back to this point, take this idea of truth, transparency, and trust, right? That's before it gets out of control and we live up to standards, or we put out standards that we can't live up to, wrestle it to the ground. And this industry is terrible for confusing facts and truths, and there's just a couple of quotes. One's from, I'm dating myself with the Jesus Christ Superstar quote, of course, but we need synergy groups are critically important in helping the industry understand the fundamental differences between trust and truths and facts. And just before we close, if one other thing you take away from this audience is this link, sharedvalue.org. So all of you may know of Michael Porter, the famous Harvard business prof. Michael Porter is a huge thinker on competitive strategy. He's been influencing, he's really understood to be one of the world's leading business gurus. He just conducted a body of research in which we participated with him that looked at oil and gas and mining industries globally in terms of corporate social responsibility and his shared value, his idea of corporate social responsibility, which is shared value, about how companies can invest in the communities in which they operate to the mutual benefit of both the communities and companies. So this is way beyond philanthropy. His report was released this week. It's called Extracting with Purpose. And it highlights, we convinced him to come to Canada. We said to him, you know, Professor Porter, if you want to look at mining and oil and gas, you can do that right here in Alberta in terms of the oil sands industry. And it's fascinating to see where we sit as a country and some of the great things that they found out about companies and communities and groups like Synergy Alberta doing shared value, perhaps not calling that, but it sets a beautiful context. So if you download that wonderful report, it'll be great fodder for your upcoming meetings. And with that, yep. All right, thank you.